The forest was silent, not the natural quiet of a peaceful night, but the kind that holds its breath before something horrible emerges. The iron gates of Blackridge Asylum stood tall, rusted and tangled with vines. Beyond them, the looming structure of the asylum awaited, casting a shadow over the moonlit path. Cassie gripped the steering wheel of her Jeep as they parked outside, her fingers tense and her eyes fixed on the dark outline of the building. The others were quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Tristan adjusted the cameras in the back seat, while Mila, flipping through an old journal, muttered under her breath about the asylum's infamous past. "We shouldn't be here," David whispered, his voice trembling. His pale eyes darted nervously to the back of the Jeep, as if expecting something to reach through the window. "They never leave. They don't let you leave." Cassie exhaled slowly. "We're not here to leave. We're here to find answers." The wind howled suddenly, and the gates creaked open as though they had been waiting for them. As the group stepped through the gates, Cassie could feel the weight of the asylum pressing down on her. The walls seemed to breathe, and the air tasted of rot and mildew. She pushed the heavy front door open, the sound of rusty hinges echoing through the entrance hall. The flashlight beam cut through the thick darkness, illuminating dust-covered furniture and peeling wallpaper. "We're going to set up base here," Tristan said, already unpacking his equipment. "Mila, can you get the power running?" Mila nodded, walking deeper into the hall, her flashlight flickering slightly. The further she went, the more distorted the graffiti on the walls became. Symbols no historian could decipher, words smeared with blood, and faces that seemed to watch her every move. Cassie stayed close behind. "Do you feel that?" Mila shivered. "This place is still alive." Suddenly, the lights flickered on, bathing the room in a sickly yellow glow. And then they heard it. A dragging sound, distant but unmistakable, coming from the floor above. "That's not the wind," David whispered, frozen in place. Cassie's heart raced as she signaled for Tristan to follow. "Let's find out what's waiting for us." Cassie led the way, flashlight beam trembling slightly as they climbed the grand staircase. Each step groaned under their weight, as if the asylum itself was protesting their intrusion. The air grew colder, carrying the faint smell of antiseptic mixed with decay. The dragging sound persisted, now closer, louder, as though something heavy was being pulled across the floor above them. David's breathing grew rapid, his fingers clenching the banister. "I remember that sound. They used to come for us at night, drag the patients from their rooms. We never saw them again." "Who did?" Cassie asked, not daring to turn around. David's voice was barely a whisper. "The ones in the walls." Tristan paused at the top of the stairs, turning on his night vision camera. "Look, whatever it is, it's not supernatural. Maybe there are squatters or animals. Let's not lose our heads." But even his voice faltered as the dragging noise suddenly stopped. Silence once again enveloped the asylum, thick and oppressive. Cassie motioned for everyone to follow her as she moved toward the source of the sound, an old patient room at the end of the corridor. The door was slightly ajar, and Cassie hesitated before pushing it open. Inside, the room was empty. The bed frame was overturned, rusted metal gleaming faintly in the dim light. Chains, bolted into the floor, lay slack, as though they had been holding someone or something. Mila entered behind her, eyes wide. "This room, it's where they kept the violent patients. They would chain them up for days, sometimes weeks. The records say they weren't human anymore by the time they were let out." Suddenly, Cassie's flashlight flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. She cursed under her breath, smacking the side of the light. But when it sputtered back on, something was different. The chains, they had moved. Cassie took a step back, her pulse quickening. Did anyone else see that? Before anyone could answer, a faint voice echoed through the halls. It was soft, almost childlike, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Help. Me." Cassie's skin prickled. "What the hell was that?" David whimpered, sinking to the floor, his hands clutching his ears. "It's them. It's always them. They call out. They want us to join them." Tristan, now visibly shaken, scanned the room with his camera. I don't see anything, but the temperature just dropped by 10 degrees. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air. "Help. Me." The voice grew louder, more desperate. Without warning, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang. Cassie rushed to it, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The air became thick, almost suffocating, as if something was closing in on them. Cassie pounded on the door, shouting, "Tristan, find a way out!" Tristan dropped the camera and began fumbling with his tools, but his hands were shaking too much to get a grip on anything. Then the walls began to tremble. From within the cracked plaster, faint shapes began to press out as though something was trying to escape. Faces, dozens of them, distorted and frozen in expressions of agony. Their mouths stretched open, and the voices returned, now layered and overlapping, filling the room with a chorus of tortured cries. Mila backed away, her eyes wide with horror. They're trapped. The patients. They never left. David was rocking back and forth on the floor, eyes tightly shut. "They'll take us too. They'll take us." Cassie's mind raced as she pulled at the door, but the chains from the bed suddenly snapped upright, coiling like snakes. They shot toward her and wrapped around her wrists, pulling her toward the center of the room. "Get them off!" Cassie screamed, thrashing against the chains, but their grip tightened, cold metal biting into her skin. Tristan scrambled toward her, trying to pry the chains loose, but they seemed to have a life of their own. The voices grew louder, almost deafening now. "Stay with us. Forever." Mila backed against the wall, her hands trembling as she held out her flashlight, illuminating the faces pressing through the walls, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Then, with a sudden burst of adrenaline, Cassie pulled hard against the chains, her muscles burning. The chains gave way just enough for her to break free, and she crashed to the floor, gasping for breath. "Let's get out of here!" Tristan shouted, grabbing his camera and slamming his shoulder into the door. After a few tries, the door cracked open, and they stumbled out into the hallway, the voices still echoing in their heads. Cassie didn't look back as they bolted down the hall, heart pounding in her chest. But just as they reached the stairs, the lights flickered again, and a figure stood at the bottom, a shadow, tall and gaunt, with long fingers outstretched, waiting for them. Cassie froze at the sight of the shadowy figure at the base of the stairs. Its form was barely human, limbs unnaturally long, with a head that seemed to tilt at an unnatural angle. The thing didn't move, but its presence alone sent chills down her spine. We can't go that way," Mila whispered, her voice tight with fear. Tristan slowly backed up, keeping his eyes on the figure. "Then where do we go? We're trapped." Cassie's heart pounded in her chest. The walls seemed to close in on them, the asylum itself conspiring to seal them inside. She turned toward the corridor they had come from, where the voices and the faces still lingered behind the cracked plaster. The asylum was alive, each shadow, each noise pushing them deeper into its grip. "We need to move. Now," Cassie urged, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. Without waiting for a response, she darted down the opposite hallway, the others following close behind. The air grew colder the deeper they went, and the lights above flickered, casting long, twisting shadows across the decaying walls. They turned corner after corner, the asylum's layout becoming a confusing maze of endless hallways and forgotten rooms. "We're lost," Tristan muttered under his breath, checking his camera's feed. "I don't even know if we're in the same wing anymore." Mila clutched her journal tightly to her chest. This place was designed to confuse. They built it with no sense of order. The patients were never supposed to find their way out. As they walked, the whispers returned, soft at first, like wind through the trees, but gradually growing louder. They couldn't make out the words, but the meaning was clear. The asylum was not done with them. Suddenly, David stopped, his eyes wide and distant. "It's happening again," he murmured, his voice hollow. Cassie turned to him. "What do you mean?" "They're watching us. Waiting." He pointed toward an old wooden door at the end of the hallway. "That's where it starts. It always starts there." Cassie hesitated, but something drew her toward the door. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, she could see a faint light flickering from within. She motioned for the others to stay back, and with a deep breath, she pushed the door open.
The room beyond was small, barely more than a cell. The walls were lined with ancient photographs, yellowed and cracked, showing doctors and patients alike. In the center of the room was a single chair, its leather straps frayed and hanging loosely from the armrests. A small table next to it held what looked like old medical instruments, each one coated with a thick layer of dust. This was a treatment room, Mila whispered as she entered behind Cassie. The worst kind. They didn't heal people here. They broke them. Cassie approached the chair cautiously. As she reached out to touch it, the whispers suddenly stopped. The room fell deathly silent, and for a brief moment all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. Then, from the corner of the room, came a low, guttural moan. Cassie spun around, her flashlight illuminating the dark corner. There, crouched in the shadows, was a figure, emaciated, its skin stretched tight over its bones. It looked up at her with hollow eyes, its mouth opening in a silent scream. Before Cassie could react, the figure lunged at her, moving with unnatural speed. She stumbled backward, crashing into the chair, but the figure stopped just short of her, its form dissolving into nothingness like smoke. The room returned to its eerie silence. What the hell was that? Tristan gasped, his camera still recording, but shaking in his hands. I don't know, Cassie breathed, struggling to steady her pulse. But whatever it was, it's not alone in here. Mila knelt by the table, her fingers tracing the edges of the old instruments. This place, the doctors, they didn't just run experiments. They invited something in. I've read stories about this, legends of places becoming vessels. They drew power from suffering, and now it won't let us go. We have to leave, David said, his voice tight with panic. Now before it gets worse, Cassie nodded, but as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. They all froze, their breath catching in their throats. Then slowly, the lights in the room began to dim, one by one, until only darkness remained. The room beyond was small, barely more than a cell. The walls were lined with ancient photographs, yellowed and cracked, showing doctors and patients alike. In the center of the room was a single chair, its leather straps frayed and hanging loosely from the armrests. A small table next to it held what looked like old medical instruments, each one coated with a thick layer of dust. This was a treatment room, Mila whispered as she entered behind Cassie. The worst kind. They didn't heal people here. They broke them. Cassie approached the chair cautiously. As she reached out to touch it, the whispers suddenly stopped. The room fell deathly silent, and for a brief moment all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. Then from the corner of the room came a low, guttural moan. Cassie spun around, her flashlight illuminating the dark corner. There, crouched in the shadows, was a figure, emaciated, its skin stretched tight over its bones. It looked up at her with hollow eyes, its mouth opening in a silent scream. Before Cassie could react, the figure lunged at her, moving with unnatural speed. She stumbled backward, crashing into the chair, but the figure stopped just short of her, its form dissolving into nothingness like smoke. The room returned to its eerie silence. What the hell was that? Tristan gasped, his camera still recording, but shaking in his hands. I don't know, Cassie breathed, struggling to steady her pulse. But whatever it was, it's not alone in here. Mila knelt by the table, her fingers tracing the edges of the old instruments. This place, the doctors, they didn't just run experiments. They invited something in. I've read stories about this, legends of places becoming vessels. They drew power from suffering, and now it won't let us go. We have to leave, David said, his voice tight with panic. Now, before it gets worse. Cassie nodded, but as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. They all froze, their breath catching in their throats. Then, slowly, the lights in the room began to dim, one by one, until only darkness remained. Cassie's breath caught in her throat as the figure's voice wrapped around her like a cold, invisible hand. She could feel the others beside her, frozen in place, but they seemed miles away, distant, as though the room itself was swallowing them whole. Tristan's voice cracked as he whispered, What is that?" The figure didn't move, but its presence grew heavier, more suffocating. The carvings on the walls pulsed in rhythm with the figure's words, each symbol glowing brighter as though they were feeding off its dark energy. "You've come, as all the others have before you," the figure said, its voice layered with something ancient and cruel. "But none have left." Cassie fought against the paralysis creeping over her body, forcing her legs to take a step forward. "What are you? What do you want from us?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if amused by the question. "I am not what you can understand. I am this place. I am every stone, every wall, every breath you take inside these halls. You are in my domain, and you will not leave." A low growl rumbled from beneath the figure's cloak, a sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the asylum itself. Cassie could feel it vibrating through the floor, through her body, making her teeth rattle. Mila let out a small gasp, her hands trembling. "We shouldn't be here. This place is wrong." Tristan, his fear giving way to anger, stepped forward. "We're not staying. We're getting out of here, and there's nothing you can do to stop us." The figure's head turned slowly toward Tristan, and though its face remained hidden, the darkness beneath the hood seemed to deepen. "Is that so?" it whispered, and with a wave of its hand, the walls of the room seemed to shift and writhe. Suddenly the floor beneath Tristan cracked with a sickening sound, and he stumbled backward, barely catching himself before falling into a gaping hole that opened up beneath him. The ground buckled and split, revealing black, bottomless voids beneath their feet, as though the asylum itself was crumbling apart. Cassie grabbed Tristan's arm, pulling him away from the edge as the floor continued to fracture. "We need to move, now!" They turned to run, but the door they had come through was gone. The walls had shifted, closing them in. The room seemed to be collapsing around them, each crack in the floor spreading wider, and the carvings on the walls pulsed faster, feeding on their terror. Cassie's mind raced. There had to be a way out, something they hadn't seen yet. But the figure remained still, towering in the center of the room, watching them with silent, unblinking eyes. "Running is pointless," the figure said, its voice cutting through the chaos. "You are mine now. You belong to me, as do all who enter this place." Mila clutched her head, her eyes wild with panic. "It's controlling everything. The asylum. It's alive because of it." Cassie's pulse pounded in her ears. They couldn't stay here, couldn't let this thing take them. She scanned the room frantically, looking for any sign of escape, but the walls continued to close in, the cracks in the floor growing wider, and then, in the corner of her eye, she saw it. A small gap in the wall, barely visible through the shifting shadows. It wasn't much, but it was something. "There!" Cassie shouted, pointing towards the gap. "There's a way out!" They bolted for the opening, the floor crumbling beneath their feet as they ran. The growling from the figure grew louder, more feral, as though the very walls were snarling at them. But they didn't stop. Cassie led the way, ducking through the narrow gap and into another dark hallway. The moment they crossed through, the room behind them sealed itself shut with a deafening crash, the figure's growl fading into the distance. Cassie leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, her heart hammering in her chest. What was that thing?" "I don't know," Tristan panted, wiping sweat from his brow. "But it wasn't human." Mila shook her head, still trembling. "It's the heart of this place, the source of everything that's happening. It's not going to let us leave." Cassie swallowed hard. "We have to find a way out. Whatever that thing is, it's keeping us trapped here, twisting the asylum to its will. If we stay, we're dead." They hurried down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The air felt thicker now, heavier with the presence of the figure they had just escaped. Cassie couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching them, tracking their every move. As they turned another corner, the hallway suddenly opened into a vast chamber, unlike anything they had seen before. The ceiling soared high above them, disappearing into darkness, and the walls were lined with rows of old wooden doors, each one slightly ajar. Cassie's stomach turned. "What is this place?" Mila's voice was barely audible. "The records? They talked about this. The patients. The ones who disappeared. They were taken to the lower levels. No one ever saw them again." Tristan took a step forward, his flashlight scanning the rows of doors. "There has to be another way out down here. We have to keep looking." But as they approached the nearest door, a low, distant hum filled the air. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with each passing second, a deep, vibrating tone that made the walls tremble. Suddenly, one of the doors swung open with a loud creak, and from within, a figure stepped out. It was David. He stood motionless in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes empty. His clothes were torn, his skin smeared with dirt and something darker, something wet. "David?" Cassie whispered, taking a cautious step toward him. "David, are you okay?" David didn't respond. He simply stared at her, his mouth slightly open as though he was trying to speak, but couldn't find the words. Then slowly, his lips moved, forming a single broken sentence. "It won't let us go." Cassie's breath caught in her throat. She stared at David, her mind racing to comprehend what she was seeing. His voice was flat, devoid of the panic and energy it once held, as though the person they knew had been hollowed out. "David?" she whispered again, stepping cautiously toward him, but he didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on her, empty, distant, as if whatever had taken him had left something else in his place. Tristan grabbed Cassie's arm, pulling her back. "That's not David. He's not the same." Mila shook her head slowly, her face pale. "It's using him. The asylum. That thing. It's controlling him." David took a slow, shuddering step forward, his movements stiff and unnatural. His hand twitched as it rose, pointing down the corridor behind them. "It won't let us go," he repeated, his voice cracking. "We're part of it now." Cassie's skin prickled with fear. Whatever had happened to David, he wasn't the same person who had been dragged through that door. Something darker, something ancient, was speaking through him. "We have to leave," Tristan muttered, backing away. "Now, before we end up like him." But just as they turned to run, the doors lining the corridor began to creak open one by one. Each door revealed a figure, pale, gaunt, their eyes sunken and hollow. Dozens of them, all dressed in the tattered remnants of patient uniforms, standing perfectly still, their bodies twisted and broken. Cassie's stomach turned as she realized what they were. The missing patients, the ones who had disappeared into the asylum's lower levels, were standing before them, staring with dead, glassy eyes. "We're not getting out," Mila whispered, her voice trembling. "This place, it's a tomb. It's already claimed us." The figures began to move, their bodies lurching toward them in unison, the sound of their shuffling feet echoing in the vast chamber. The air grew colder, the oppressive sense of dread tightening around them like a noose. "Run!" Tristan shouted, grabbing Mila by the wrist and dragging her toward the far end of the chamber. Cassie followed close behind, her heart pounding as the dead closed in around them. The hallway stretched on endlessly, a maze of doors and shadows, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. The farther they ran, the more the walls seemed to close in, warping and shifting as though the asylum itself was alive, reshaping to trap them. Cassie glanced over her shoulder, her breath catching in her throat. The figures were gaining on them, their movements slow but relentless, driven by something far more terrifying than hunger. The dead had no need for haste. They knew there was no escape. "We're trapped," Mila gasped, struggling to keep up as they turned another corner. "It's leading us in circles." Cassie's mind raced. She couldn't let them give up. There had to be a way out, a weak point in the asylum's grip, something they could use to break free. But the longer they ran, the more hopeless it felt. The air itself seemed to grow heavier with every step, weighing them down, pulling them deeper into the asylum's clutches. Suddenly they stumbled into a large, circular room. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, its surface etched with the same symbols they had seen earlier. Surrounding the altar were more carvings, deep and jagged, glowing with a faint, eerie light that pulsed in time with their racing hearts. Cassie stopped, staring at the altar. Something about it felt different, powerful, as though it was the source of the asylum's dark energy. She could feel it in the air, thick and electric, pulling at her from all sides. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where it's all coming from." Mila shook her head, backing away from the altar. No. We need to leave. We need to find a way out of here." But Cassie knew there was no leaving. Not yet. Not until they faced whatever was controlling this place. The figure, the asylum, the dead. They were all connected, all drawn to this one spot. Tristan approached the altar cautiously, his eyes scanning the symbols. "This is older than the asylum. It's ancient. Whatever they were doing here, they didn't build this place to treat anyone. They built it to worship." "Worship what?" Mila asked, her voice shaky. Cassie stepped closer, running her fingers along the carvings. Something darker, something they couldn't control. As if in response, the air around them grew colder, and the lights in the room flickered wildly. The walls began to hum, a deep, low vibration that rattled their bones. From the shadows, the dead began to emerge again, their hollow eyes fixed on the altar. "They're protecting it," Tristan said, his voice tight with fear. "They're guarding whatever's down here." Cassie felt the pull of the altar, the dark energy radiating from it. She knew they had to do something, but what? How could they break the asylum's hold? And then, from the darkness, a familiar voice echoed through the room. "You can't stop it," David's voice whispered. "It's too late. You're already part of it." Cassie spun around, but David was nowhere to be seen. His voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, circling them like a predator waiting to strike. "You've come so far," the voice continued, growing louder. "But this is where it ends. You belong to the asylum now. You belong to me." The dead figures closed in, their faces twisted in silent agony. Cassie's heart raced, her mind frantic. There had to be a way out, some way to break free. And then she saw it. At the base of the altar, hidden in the shadows, was a small, blackened book. Its pages were old and crumbling, but the symbols on the cover matched those etched into the walls. "That's it," Cassie said, rushing forward. "That's how we stop it." Tristan grabbed her arm. "Are you sure? What if it makes things worse?" "We don't have a choice," Cassie replied, pulling free. "We need to end this." With trembling hands, she picked up the book and opened it. The pages were filled with ancient writing, but the symbols were familiar, matching those on the walls and the altar. She didn't know how she understood it, but the words seemed to speak to her, guiding her. As she began to read aloud, the room shuddered violently. The dead figures faltered, their movements slowing, as though something was pulling them back. The air around the altar crackled with energy, and the symbols on the walls flared brightly. casting the room in an otherworldly glow. The voice of the figure roared in fury, its words incomprehensible but filled with rage. The asylum trembled, the very walls groaning as though the building itself was being torn apart. "Keep going," Mila shouted, her eyes wide with fear. Cassie's voice shook, but she continued reading, each word pulling the asylum's dark energy into the book, trapping it, binding it. The dead figures began to crumble, their bodies dissolving into dust as the asylum's power weakened. The growl of the figure grew distant, fading into nothingness as the final words left Cassie's lips. The room fell silent. The air was still. Cassie lowered the book, her hands trembling. The symbols on the walls dimmed, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. The asylum, once alive with dark energy, felt empty, hollow. Tristan stared at the altar, his chest heaving. Did we stop it?" Cassie nodded slowly, though she wasn't entirely sure. "I think so. I think it's over." But as they turned to leave, a faint, barely perceptible whisper echoed through the room, sending a shiver down Cassie's spine. "It's never over." Cassie's skin crawled at the sound of the whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but she knew it was there, lurking just beneath the surface. The room was quiet now, the hum of energy gone, but the silence felt wrong. Too still, too empty, like the calm before something worse. Tristan rubbed his arms, glancing around warily. "We should leave, now, before whatever that was decides to come back." Mila nodded, her face pale and strained. "If it's over, why does it still feel like we're being watched?" Cassie didn't answer. She didn't want to admit that she felt it too, that the asylum's suffocating presence still seemed to cling to them like a shadow. But the dead were gone, and the walls no longer groaned with malevolence. They had done what they came to do, right? They moved quickly through the halls, retracing their steps, but the asylum was different now. The doors no longer creaked open on their own. The symbols that once glowed menacingly had faded into the cold stone. It was like walking through the corpse of a giant beast, the remnants of its power still palpable, but dying. They reached the spiral staircase that had led them into the depths, its iron steps slick with rust and age. Cassie hesitated at the base, looking up into the darkness above. "Do you think it's safe up there?" she asked quietly. Tristan nodded, though his expression betrayed his uncertainty. "We broke whatever was holding this place together. There's nothing left." But as they began to ascend, a low, distant sound reverberated through the air. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, like the rumble of a distant storm. But it grew louder with each step they took, a deep, rhythmic pounding that seemed to echo from the heart of the asylum itself. Mila's hand tightened on the railing. "Do you hear that?" Cassie stopped, her pulse quickening. It was a heartbeat, slow and steady, coming from deep within the walls. The asylum wasn't dead. It was still alive, still breathing. "We need to move faster," Cassie said, her voice tense. "Whatever's left here, it's waking up." They hurried up the stairs, their footsteps clanging against the iron steps as the heartbeat grew louder, faster. The walls began to tremble again, faint at first, but building with each passing second. By the time they reached the upper level, the entire building was vibrating with the sound. The walls bulged and twisted, as if the asylum was stretching, reshaping itself in response to their intrusion. It wasn't going to let them go easily. Cassie pushed open the heavy wooden door that led back to the main hall. They stumbled into the familiar space, but something was wrong. The once vast, open room had shrunk. The walls had drawn closer, the ceiling sagging ominously, as though the building was collapsing in on itself. Tristan's eyes darted around wildly. "It's not letting us leave." Mila's voice was filled with panic. "I thought we stopped it. We read the book. Cassie's head spun as the floor beneath them rippled, the boards shifting like liquid under their feet. "It's not enough. We may have weakened it, but it's still here. We're still trapped in its grip." The walls continued to close in, the heartbeat pounding in their ears, faster and faster. Cassie could feel the pressure building around them, the asylum tightening like a fist. They were running out of time. "There has to be another way," Tristan shouted, pushing against the walls as if he could hold them back. "We can't die here." Cassie's eyes darted to the far end of the hall, where a faint glow emanated from behind a cracked door. She could feel it pulling her, something deep and ancient beckoning them forward. "There!" she yelled. "It's another way out." They bolted towards the door, the floor rippling beneath their feet as the walls groaned and buckled around them. Cassie pushed the door open, and they stumbled into a narrow passageway. The glow came from ahead, flickering like firelight. The passage twisted and turned, its walls growing narrower with each step. Cassie's heart pounded as they ran, the asylum's heartbeat chasing them like a predator hunting its prey. And then abruptly, the passage opened up into a large, circular chamber. In the center of the room stood a massive iron door, its surface covered in strange, twisting symbols, identical to those etched into the altar below. The light was coming from beneath the door, a sickly, pulsing glow that filled the chamber with an unnatural heat. Cassie's chest tightened. This is it. Mila looked at the door, her eyes wide with fear. "What is this place? It's not an exit." Tristan ran his hand over the iron surface, his brow furrowed. "This door, it's holding something back, something powerful." Cassie felt the energy radiating from the door, thick and suffocating. Whatever was behind it was the source of the asylum's power, the heart of the darkness that had infected every corner of this cursed place. "We can't leave until we destroy this," she said, her voice firm. "It's the last piece." Mila shook her head frantically. "We can't. What if opening it makes everything worse? What if we're releasing whatever's behind it?" Cassie took a deep breath, her mind racing. The asylum had twisted everything, controlling the dead, warping reality. If they left without destroying it, the cycle would start again. They'd never be free. "There's no other way," Cassie said. "We have to end it." With a heavy heart, she placed her hand on the iron door. The metal was cold beneath her touch, sending a jolt of electricity through her body. The symbols etched into the door began to glow brighter, responding to her presence. Tristan stepped forward, placing his hand beside hers. "We do this together." Mila hesitated but finally joined them, her trembling hand resting on the door's surface. The symbols flared to life, burning with intense light, and the door creaked open. The heat that rushed out was overwhelming, suffocating, as though they were standing at the mouth of a furnace. But what lay beyond wasn't fire. It was darkness, an endless, yawning void, swirling with malevolent energy, pulsing in time with the asylum's heartbeat. The air buzzed with power, the same ancient, twisted energy they had felt throughout the asylum. Cassie's breath hitched as she peered into the abyss. This is what it's been hiding. This is the source. A cold voice whispered from the darkness, familiar and terrifying. "You've come so far, but you'll never leave." The ground beneath them began to shake violently, and the void started to pull them in, the force dragging them toward its gaping maw. Cassie's fingers dug into the iron doorframe. "We have to close it, now!" Tristan and Mila struggled against the pull, but the force was too strong. The darkness inside the void seemed to wrap around them, pulling at their bodies, their minds, like invisible hands dragging them into oblivion. "Cassie!" Tristan yelled, his voice strained as he fought to hold on. Cassie gritted her teeth, her heart pounding as she pushed against the door. "We're not dying here." The heavy iron door stood sealed once more, the void beyond it quiet, too quiet. For a moment, the world felt still, as if the asylum had finally relented, releasing its grip on their minds and bodies. But Cassie wasn't convinced. The whisper still echoed faintly in the back of her mind, like a forgotten melody playing just beyond the edge of hearing. They staggered back to the main hall, every step feeling like it could be their last in this cursed place. The air was lighter now, no longer thick with the crushing malevolence that had twisted the walls and floors, but there was something lingering, something unseen. "Do you think it's really over?" Mila asked, her voice trembling. She clutched her arms to herself, her skin pale and glistening with sweat. The asylum had drained all of them. "I don't know," Tristan replied, his eyes scanning the walls as if expecting them to close in again. "It feels different, but I still don't trust this place." Cassie remained silent, her mind racing. The void had felt endless, alive with a dark, ancient energy that she couldn't shake. She had seen into it, felt its pull, and now, even with the door closed, it felt like it was watching her, waiting. "We need to leave," she said, her voice firm, cutting through the uneasy silence. "Now, while we still can." They headed toward the main entrance, the long corridor that had once twisted and stretched impossibly, now seeming more familiar, more stable. But as they approached the exit, Cassie felt a chill run down her spine. The door was gone. In its place, the walls stretched unbroken, smooth stone, where there had once been a heavy wooden exit. The asylum had shifted again, reshaping itself, trapping them. "No," Mila whispered, her eyes wide with horror. "No, no, no, this can't be happening." Tristan pounded his fists against the wall, his voice breaking with frustration. "It's playing with us. It won't let us leave." Cassie stepped back, her heart sinking. The asylum had shifted before, its rooms twisting and rearranging themselves as though the building were alive. She had thought they had weakened it, but it seemed the asylum still held them in its grasp. "We need to stay calm," Cassie said, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "There has to be another way out. We'll find it." But as the words left her lips, a cold, mocking laughter echoed through the halls, soft at first, then louder, filling the space around them. It was the voice they had heard before, the one from the void. It hadn't been silenced after all. "You think you can leave?" the voice whispered, each word dripping with malice. "This place is mine. You will never escape," Mila screamed, covering her ears, as if the voice were burrowing into her mind. Tristan grabbed her, pulling her close, but his face was pale, his eyes wild with fear. Cassie felt the weight of the asylum pressing down on them again. The walls seeming to close in, the air growing thick with dread. The voice was everywhere and nowhere at once, an unseen force that twisted around them like a predator, circling its prey. "You came here to destroy me," the voice hissed, "but you only fed me. You gave me your fear, your pain, and now you belong to me." The walls began to tremble, the floor shaking beneath their feet. Cassie's breath quickened as she glanced around, searching for an escape, but the corridors were twisting again, warping before her eyes. "We need to move," Tristan shouted, his voice barely audible over the rumbling. "Now!" Cassie grabbed Mila's arm, pulling her forward, and together they ran, the ground shifting and buckling beneath their feet. The hallway ahead stretched impossibly long, doors flickering in and out of existence as if the asylum itself couldn't decide on its form. The laughter followed them, echoing through the halls, growing louder with every step. "There!" Cassie pointed to a narrow staircase that hadn't been there moments before. Upstairs, they raced up the steps, the laughter growing distant, but still present, always lurking. The staircase wound higher and higher, spiraling upward like a snake coiling around itself. Cassie didn't know where it led, but it was the only path left to them. Finally, they reached the top, bursting through a door that led into a small circular room. The walls were lined with old, crumbling bookshelves, and in the center of the room stood a single large window. Moonlight streamed through, casting pale, ghostly light across the room. Cassie ran to the window, peering out. They were high above the asylum grounds, higher than they had been before. She could see the twisted forest surrounding the asylum, the barren trees swaying in the wind. It's the outside, Mila gasped, her voice filled with disbelief. For a moment, hope flickered in Cassie's chest. They could escape. They could climb out, find their way down. But as she looked closer, her heart sank. The window was sealed. The glass was old and thick, embedded deep into the stone, with no way to open it. They were trapped. Tristan slammed his fist against the window, but it didn't even crack. No, this can't be it. The voice returned, soft and mocking, as though it were standing right behind them. There is no escape. You belong to me now. Cassie's hands trembled as she stepped back from the window. The asylum had brought them here on purpose. It was toying with them, showing them freedom just out of reach, mocking their efforts. We're not giving up, Cassie whispered, though even she didn't believe her words anymore. The asylum had them, and it wasn't going to let go. The cold air in the circular room felt stifling despite the open window, as if the asylum was drawing the life from them, pulling them deeper into its grip. Cassie paced back and forth, her breath shallow, her mind racing for any possible solution. They couldn't stay here, trapped like rats in a cage, taunted by freedom just outside their reach. We can't let it win, she muttered, more to herself than the others. There has to be a way out, a real way. Tristan slumped against the wall, his face a mask of exhaustion. It's too strong, Cassie. It's playing with us. Mila sat on the floor, hugging her knees, her eyes glassy. Maybe there never was a way out. Maybe we were doomed the moment we stepped inside. No! Cassie snapped, her frustration boiling over. That's exactly what it wants us to believe. It wants us to lose hope, to give in. The voice, that ever-present whisper, laughed softly in the back of her mind. Hope is a fleeting thing in this place. Cassie shivered but refused to acknowledge it. She wouldn't let the asylum break her, no matter how close she felt to the edge. There had to be something they'd missed, something they hadn't tried. Her gaze flickered over the room. Bookshelves crammed with old, decaying volumes, dusty wooden furniture, the heavy stone walls. The walls. She stopped pacing, her eyes narrowing at the cold, ancient stones. There was something off about them. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing over the rough surface, feeling for what, exactly? She didn't know, but something about this place, the shifting corridors, the vanishing doors, made her wonder if the walls were as solid as they seemed. What are you doing? Tristan asked, his voice tinged with defeat. Cassie didn't answer immediately. She pressed her hand harder against the wall, feeling for anything, softness, movement, even a sound. Her pulse quickened when her fingers brushed over a section that felt different, almost hollow. Help me, she said, her voice rising with sudden urgency. This wall, there's something behind it. Tristan stood up, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He joined her, running his hands over the wall. You think there's a passage? It wouldn't surprise me, Cassie replied. This place is alive, shifting. Maybe it's hiding something. Mila, still sitting on the floor, looked up, her eyes wide with fear and a flicker of hope. What if it's another trap? Cassie hesitated for a moment. She didn't have an answer. The asylum had toyed with them from the beginning, luring them deeper into its clutches. But there was no other choice. Sitting here, waiting to be swallowed by the darkness, wasn't an option. It might be, she admitted, but it's a chance. We have to take it. Together, Tristan and Cassie searched the wall, knocking and pressing until Tristan found the weak point, a thin crack running vertically along the stones. With a few strong pushes, the stones shifted slightly, dust falling from the cracks. "There's something behind here," he said, his voice strained. "Help me push." Cassie joined him, their hands working together to pry the stones loose. The sound of scraping stone echoed in the room as they forced the wall open. Finally, a section of the wall gave way, revealing a narrow, dark passage beyond. Cassie's heart raced as she peered into the darkness. The air that wafted out was stale, thick with the smell of decay and dampness. It wasn't inviting, but it was a way forward. "I don't like this," Mila whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't like this at all." "Neither do I," Tristan admitted, "but it's better than staying here." Cassie swallowed her fear and stepped into the passage. The walls were close, pressing in on either side, the ceiling low enough that she had to duck her head. The darkness swallowed them almost immediately, the only light coming from the faint glow of their phones. As they moved deeper, the laughter in Cassie's mind grew softer, but the sense of unease only intensified. The passage twisted and turned, leading them downward, deeper into the heart of the asylum. The air grew colder, heavier, as if they were descending into something ancient and forgotten. "This place, it feels wrong," Mila whispered from behind. "Like we're walking into a tomb." Cassie couldn't shake the feeling either. Every step felt like it was taking them further from the world they knew, pulling them into something much darker, but there was no going back now. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened up into a vast underground chamber. The ceiling loomed high above them, supported by thick stone pillars covered in strange ancient carvings. At the far end of the room stood an altar, its surface stained dark, surrounded by more of the twisted symbols they had seen before. Cassie's stomach churned at the sight. This is the heart of it, isn't it?" Tristan nodded, his face pale. "It must be. This is where it all began." Mila's voice was trembling. "What do we do now? We can't destroy this, can we?" Cassie stepped forward, her eyes locked on the altar. "We have to try. This is what's keeping the asylum alive, what's been feeding off us. If we destroy it, maybe we can break free." She approached the altar cautiously, every instinct telling her to run, to leave this cursed place behind. But she couldn't, not yet. As her hand reached out to touch the altar, the air in the chamber shifted, the temperature plummeted, and the oppressive darkness seemed to close in around them. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall and gaunt, its face hidden beneath a tattered hood. Cassie froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, its presence radiating a cold, ancient power. "You cannot destroy what has always been," the figure whispered, its voice low and resonant, filling the chamber. "This place is eternal, and so are you." The figure raised its hand, and the symbols on the altar began to glow with a sickly light. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the chamber itself seemed to come alive. "We need to get out of here," Tristan shouted, grabbing Cassie's arm. "Now!" But Cassie couldn't move. The figure's presence held her in place, its words echoing in her mind. Eternal. She could feel the weight of it, the endless cycle that had trapped so many before them. This wasn't just a building. It was something far more ancient, far more malevolent. "Cassie!" Tristan shouted again, pulling harder. With a sudden surge of will, Cassie tore her gaze away from the figure and ran, the others following close behind. The chamber shook violently as they sprinted back through the passage, the walls cracking and crumbling around them. The laughter returned, louder this time, echoing through the corridors as the asylum came to life, furious at their defiance. The ground buckled, throwing them off balance, but they kept running, desperate to escape the clutches of the ancient evil that now pursued them. They burst back into the circular room, the window still shining with pale moonlight, but the walls were closing in again, The asylum trying to trap them once more. Cassie looked around wildly, her mind racing. There had to be a way out, a real way out. And then she saw it. The moonlight. The window wasn't sealed anymore. The glass had cracked, a narrow opening leading to the outside world. "Go!" she shouted, pointing to the window. "It's our only chance." Cassie sprinted toward the cracked window, her heart hammering in her chest as the room seemed to collapse around them. Tristan followed close behind, dragging Mila, who was frozen with terror, her eyes wide and glazed over. The asylum groaned and trembled, the walls twisting as if the building itself was furious at their attempt to escape. "Come on, we're almost there," Tristan shouted, his voice barely audible over the deafening sound of stone grinding against stone. Cassie grabbed the jagged edges of the broken glass and pulled herself up, wincing as it sliced her palms. She squeezed through the narrow gap, her body barely fitting through the small opening, the cold night air hitting her like a slap in the face. Outside, the world felt eerily still, too quiet compared to the chaos they had just left behind, but there was no time to think. She turned back to the window. "Hurry!" Cassie urged, holding out her hand. Tristan was next, helping Mila up as she trembled uncontrollably, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The fear had almost paralyzed her, but she managed to climb up, her hand slipping into Cassie's. With one hard pull, Cassie yanked her through the window, just as the walls inside began to crack and split, the air filling with a thunderous roar. But when Tristan tried to follow, the asylum fought back. The window frame buckled, and the glass began to seal itself up again, the jagged edges shifting and stretching, the stone around it moving like a living thing. Tristan's hand slipped from the ledge, and for a moment, it looked like the building was going to pull him back inside, into the void they had barely escaped. "No!" Cassie screamed, reaching for him. "Hold on!" Tristan's face twisted with effort, his muscles straining as he fought against the force pulling him back. "I can't!" But just as he was about to lose his grip, Cassie caught his arm, her fingers digging into his wrist with desperate strength. With one final, agonizing pull, she dragged him through the window. Just as the asylum's shrieking walls closed the gap, the glass sealing up behind them with a final, ominous snap, the three of them tumbled to the ground outside, gasping for air, their bodies shaking with adrenaline and terror. They were free. For a moment they lay there, staring up at the sky, the cold earth beneath them a stark contrast to the suffocating air inside the asylum. The forest loomed around them, the twisted trees swaying in the night breeze. But for the first time in what felt like forever, they weren't trapped. Cassie slowly sat up, her hands trembling as she stared back at the asylum. The massive stone structure loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding, but there was something different now. The oppressive, malevolent force that had once radiated from the building felt diminished, weakened, but not gone. Mila was crying softly, her arms wrapped around herself, as if she could barely believe they had escaped. "We're out," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We're really out." Tristan sat beside her, his face pale but resolute. "Yeah," he said, his voice shaky. "But is it over?" Cassie didn't answer immediately. Her gaze was still locked on the asylum, her heart still racing with the remnants of fear. The building sat silent now, its windows dark, the oppressive presence no longer pressing down on them. But deep inside, she knew the truth. "It's not over," she whispered, more to herself than to the others. Tristan turned to her, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean? We escaped?" Cassie shook her head. "The asylum, it's still there. We barely scratched the surface. Whatever that thing was, it's ancient, and it's not done with us." Mila shuddered, her hands gripping her arms tightly. "So what now? We just leave? Pretend this never happened?" Cassie stood slowly, her eyes narrowing as she looked back at the building that had nearly consumed them. "We can't just leave it. If we do, it'll find someone else. It'll keep going, keep feeding. We have to stop it. For good." Tristan stared at her, disbelief mixing with exhaustion. How? We barely survived in there. You saw what it did to us. Cassie turned to face him, her expression grim but determined. There's something deeper in there. Something more than what we saw. The altar, the symbols. It's all part of something bigger. We need to find out what it is and destroy it. Mila's eyes widened with horror. You're talking about going back? Cassie nodded slowly. Not now. Not yet. But eventually, yes. Silence fell over the group as they processed what that meant. The idea of going back into the asylum, of facing the ancient evil that had almost claimed them, was unthinkable. But Cassie was right. It wasn't over. Not yet. We'll need to be prepared, Tristan said finally, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Next time, we'll be ready. Cassie looked back at the asylum one last time, her jaw set with determination. Next time, she echoed softly. They turned away from the building and began walking through the twisted forest, the moonlight casting long, eerie shadows across the path. The asylum loomed behind them, silent for now, but Cassie could feel its presence still lingering, watching, waiting. The nightmare wasn't over, but they had survived the first encounter, and next time they would come back stronger. As they disappeared into the forest, the wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves on the ground, and from the darkness of the asylum, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper echoed through the night, carried on the wind. You cannot escape forever.